the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission is a sham designed to whitewash the atrocities committed by the government. It will not bring any justice to the Sri Lankan people, and it's very important that that message goes out internationally, and so that when they walk onto the world stage and they pretend that they have established such an investigation and that justice will be done, that they're unable to do that, that people are faced with the reality of what that commission represents. And instead, I would support the call and urge the building of a movement for a genuinely independent, genuinely impartial commission of inquiry, a public tribunal based on accountable representatives of the working class, the poor, the small farmers, all of the different sectors of society in Sri Lanka that have been affected by the war. Such a public tribunal would only be able to operate on the basis of no intimidation by the government and by the Sinhala chauvinists, no climate of fear against them doing their work, full access to the camps, and on that basis being able to achieve demands like, well, the names of everybody who are still in the camps, but also crucially the release of everybody from the camps, the death certificates of those who have been massacred, those who have been killed by the Sri Lankan army, all those immediate democratic demands or demands of the Tamil-speaking people that need to be met in terms of building for a lasting peace. But also more generally, I want to make a broader point, which relates to the whole discussion, in particular maybe the first discussion that we had today, which is that in terms of fighting for a really lasting peace, you have to put the atrocities that took place in the context of the systematic oppression of the Tamil people over a course of decades, the systematic denial of the right to self-determination for the Tamil people, the attack on democratic rights generally in Sri Lankan society, the increasing concentration of power in the hands of the president, the denial of the freedom of the press in Sri Lanka, attacks on those who have spoken out against the regime. So there's attacks on democratic rights and minority rights, but also to put it in the context of a denial and an attack on the economic and social rights of ordinary people, working class people, young people, poor people in Sri Lanka. I read a statistic that the UN, according to the UN, they estimate that 45% of Sri Lankan people live on less than $2 a day, which is something particularly prevalent in the Tamil-speaking community, but also obviously affects many Sinhala-speaking people. You have the use of the free trade zones, which is being referred to as a way of super exploitation of cheap labour for the benefit often of major European-based multinationals, the likes of Marks and Spencer, which is obviously British-based, in which I understand there are major strike movements actually taking place at the moment in some of these free trade zones, and systematic inequality, discrimination and oppression of women, as well as all of the minorities in Sri Lanka. And that the development of a real peace process involves taking up and resolving all of those issues. It's on that basis that you can have a real and lasting peace whereby people can live in respect for each other, equality and full rights, including the right to self-determination. The next question I just want to deal with is the question of what are the forces that can bring this about on the international stage, what is the relationship of forces, and also in Sri Lanka. Firstly, on the question of the European Parliament, it's obviously very good that you have so many people here expressing what has been happening in Sri Lanka, giving really graphic and very moving examples. And I'd say it's the case that people who have come here maybe have a hope, which is understandable, that the European Parliament will take up these issues, will campaign on behalf of the Tamil people, will speak to the world about what is happening. And unfortunately I have to bring some bad news in terms of being honest about what the situation is in the European Parliament. The situation is that you have some, not an insignificant number of important friends in the left group, in the Green group, in some of the other groups, of people who will stand up and fight for Tamil rights, will speak out against the oppression that takes place. However, it is the case that a majority of people in the European Parliament are not of that opinion. And it's not an accident that they're not of that opinion, it's because they represent vested interests in their countries, the capitalist class, the multinationals based in their countries, who would prefer that the outrageous human rights abuses, democratic rights abuses don't come out, aren't exposed, that they are able to continue to operate with the Rajapaksa government, to continue to operate to exploit workers in the free trade zones, and to continue to profit off the misery of people in Sri Lanka. Again, the example of Marks and Spencer, who played an important role of trying to resist the one sanction that was placed upon Sri Lanka, withdrawal of preferential trade preferences, trade access and GSP+, because it would hurt their economic interests. So it's important to recognise that relationship of forces, and therefore to understand that the problems that exist in Sri Lanka, unfortunately, they won't be resolved in the European Parliament. But what I see my role as, and the role of other people who campaign for the rights of the Tamil people, is to speak up, be a voice of opposition, be a voice to the world explaining what is happening, speaking up against the orthodoxy, the establishment that exists within this Parliament, against the Sri Lankan government when they come and speak at various committees, which they're always invited to speak to, and so to give the real story of what is happening, and to act as a mobilising point, to encourage other people to get active, to encourage other people to get organised around these issues, from the Tamil diaspora around the world, people in Sri Lanka, but also other people who wouldn't otherwise be aware of what is happening. Part of that, I think, can be the trip to Sri Lanka, which I'm very looking forward to going on a trip, a fact-finding trip to Sri Lanka, where we will demand access from the government to the north of the country, demand access to the camps, and not just the supposedly show camps that they have, to try to expose what's going on to the world's media and give people information. And so that's, in my opinion, the main role that we can play. Those same points, in my opinion, also apply to the United Nations. It's important that we publicise the results of the panel, the findings of the panel. They are very important. It's important we pressurise the panel to act on their recommendations. But at the same time, I wouldn't have any illusions that they actually will, that the UN will really intervene on behalf of the Tamil people. Because what is the difference between Libya and Sri Lanka? And to simplify it to very simple words, to one word, a very important difference is oil. The reality is that the UN represents the interests of the major powers around the world. It's a club of the major powers. It represents their interests as opposed to the interests of the majority of ordinary people. So a message that I have for you, which isn't the easy option, but it's that the real force to achieve justice in Sri Lanka, to achieve the right to self-determination in Sri Lanka for the Tamil people and for other minorities, is the people themselves. That's the force you have to rely on, with important allies in places like the European Parliament, to try and assist that. But it is that power of ordinary people that I know, in the context of decades of oppression, in the context of particularly the outrages that people have been through, is a difficult thing to do and to try to organise. But unfortunately, in my opinion, that is the reality. And I would encourage you to take inspiration from the Arab Spring, from the massive revolutions taking place in Tunisia and Egypt. 2 weeks ago I visited Tunisia, whereby you had a brutal dictatorship of Ben Ali, where any protest movements were repressed. There were no organised oppositional political parties. Any trade union movements were repressed. Any movements, in any case, were repressed brutally by the government. And on the 14th of January, on the basis of preparation that had been laid through activists like yourselves, you had a mass movement of workers and young people. And they ousted the Ben Ali regime, and they opened a period of revolution in Tunisia, across the region, but it's also spread to Europe. As you see in Spain at the moment, in Greece, that revolution, the idea of fundamental change, has been put on the agenda. And I think that's, does have to be an important inspiration in terms of the power of ordinary people to achieve change, even in the context of massive, horrific oppression. Just one final point to bring to the debate about tactics that maybe has featured throughout the discussion, and bring maybe some of the experience that exists from Ireland, which is that in Ireland, you will know that the north of Ireland is controlled by the British state, and that historically speaking you had systematic discrimination and oppression against the Catholic minority in Northern Ireland over an extended period of time. In reaction to that, there was a movement, I'd say individual terror, in the sense of shootings, bombings, by a paramilitary group based on just that section of the population against the British state. The conclusion is that that movement has not been successful. It wasn't able to defeat the British state. It wasn't able to defeat capitalism on the island of Ireland. And the position that the Socialist Party has in Ireland, and we operate in the north of Ireland as well, is to try to create a united movement of working class people who have common interests, common Catholic working class people, Protestant working class people, against imperialism, but also against capitalism across the state. And that is just a contribution I would bring to the discussion that would exist amongst in the Tamil community, and I would support the call for building such a united movement to try and build connections with progressive Sinhala workers, Sinhala youth, the trade union movement, the left, that these people are potentially your natural allies to build such a united movement to tackle the dictatorship, to call for democratic rights, the right to self-determination, but also the question of building a society based on solidarity, where the resources of the country are not used by the multinationals, not used by corrupt elites, but used in the interests of the mass of ordinary people. And I think that's what we need to do. And obviously, that is a hard task, but what I've heard today does give me confidence in the courage, the heroism of many of the Tamil people, the ability to forge such a struggle that can be successful and bring fundamental change. Thank you very much.